We're live. Hi, welcome.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
welcome for the Tools Team workshop. Today, as a topic, I'd like to talk about the replays about the handling of JavaScript assets. How it's also sharing. So tell us.
Yeah. So that's the OpenQA repository. That's where the code for our web application is hosted. Maybe to give you actually, well, most people will likely be familiar with how OpenQA looks like, but maybe not all. So that's how it looks like.
Could you zoom in
So,
a little bit here?
okay.
Like on every page, a little bit of, yeah, like 121. Yep, that's
Yeah. So you see it's using Bootstrap, and under the hood, it also uses jQuery and a few other JavaScript libraries, like for the table rendering here. And yeah, all of this is actually packaged as an RPM package and then deployed on the server by simply installing that package. And you can also install OpenQA on your own machine by simply installing the RPM package we provide for OpenSUSE distributions. So, of course, the question is, how are dependencies like Bootstrap and jQuery, data tables, and so on, how are those dependencies ending up in the RPM package? Because those are normally not really just dependencies on RPM level, especially because we require specific versions of them and only update um, yeah, rather manually. Also, that's actually also kind of automated, which I will go into. Yeah, that's what we will cover today. So it's more a workshop for OBS actually than for OpenQA test development. Yeah, but maybe you find it interesting. So first of all, we decided to use npm for our dependencies. So I can also zoom in here a little bit. Using npm basically means we have two files in our repository, package.json and packagelog.json. And package.json simply specifies what dependencies we have. So it's really a bunch of dependencies. We also have some dev dependencies for linting mainly. And yeah, those are basically just installed via npm in. And that leads also to the creation of this huge file, which of course we don't have to touch manually. It's basically just npm keeping track of the explicit version of all the dependencies involved. So not just the few here that we consume directly, but also dependencies of dependencies. Yeah, but this file is of course kind of relevant because also when packaging the RPM package, we need to be aware of all dependencies. Um, yeah, and I think it's also best practice to actually have this file in the Git checkout and not ignore it. Um, yeah, so that's about how the dependencies come in. Maybe a short side note about how we consume them in OpenQA. It's a Perl-based web application using the Modulicious framework. And for assets, we use asset pack, which is probably not really what you would do today if you would start a new project. But back in the day, it seemed okay. And it's still actually working for us. Also, probably using a proper bundler would be what you would do right now if you started a new project. But here we simply specify the files we need, and those are all just pointing into the npm directory. And if you were to develop a new feature in OpenQA which needs to change dependencies, you would simply also install the corresponding npm module and reference the relevant files from that module here. And this takes care of um, creating tags, and it will also be able to um, yeah, append files together so they are actually one big file. And that's also where our own JavaScript and style sheets come into play, like these here. Um, yeah, so that's mainly it. And now the interesting part. So, because that was all pretty standard, I mean, hopefully that's not the standard anymore to use asset pack, but still nothing so exciting. Um, So the cool thing about it, if you have some bots enabled, like Depender bot on your GitHub project, you can get merge requests like this merge request for updating certain packages. So here it updated the patch version of some nested dependency we have. Um, yeah, and that was created by the bot. And in the end, well, we were able to comment here a bit and approve changes. And then another bot merged it automatically after tests have passed. Now we actually changed it so things will be merged automatically after a certain waiting time, which gives us the opportunity to still be able to look at things manually, but since it's normally caught by test when something goes down, hopefully, um, it will be caught and not merged anyway.
Right. So
Um,
in the say in the boring case, you don't need to, and it will just all.
yeah, so that's about the bot updates. Of course, for you, maybe if you wanted to contribute to OpenQA, it would be more interesting to know how would you actually change a dependency. And I actually created one pull request quite recently, which would use Ace Editor instead of CodeMirror, because we are currently a bit behind, one major version behind the current of CodeMirror.
Ah,
But
I think you can show that that was actually also triggered by Dependabot because like trying to yeah, there you have it, bump
right,
code mirror.
so of course we also got an update for this, but unfortunately tests didn't pass because CodeMirror 6 is basically a different um, API and way of consuming the library. So yeah, that didn't work too well. So that's why we had to do this change manually. But at least we are aware of those updates by those created pull requests. And yeah, what have I changed here for updating? Well, I simply changed the source files we use, and of course the related code that had to change anyway. I mean, also just updating to the next version of Code Mirror didn't just work. Yeah, so we changed that. Of course, that's still just a draft, so I haven't run the JavaScript linter yet, so we get many of these errors. Um, and I just scroll down very quickly because you don't need to follow here. So now we are actually at the interesting parts. So basically, Code Mirror got removed, Ace Editor got in, and that's also reflected in the log file, which has the same, except that it also states the explicit versions. So yeah, that's it. You only have to update these JSON files. And that's, of course, done by running npm rm code mirror in this case, and then npm in, and in this case, ace builds. So you don't have to deal with the files manually normally. You can just run npm commands and then add the diff of in these files to your commit. Yeah, so I think that's the interesting part code-wise. And you can see in this pull request that we have also checks that run on OBS. I will go into them after the next section, but I will conclude um, with the code repository section by mentioning also the makefile, because if you develop locally, you normally want to have these dependencies because otherwise, for instance, tests and of course the web application will not run. So that's not what I was wanting to show. Um, Basically, we have in our makefile targets to run tests, and here the idea is to actually also use make to update the local node modules, the ones that are locally installed, as needed when package log changes. So you can, as before, just um, run the tests, and it works out of the box, downloading things on the fly as necessary. Oh, and I mentioned as before, so before we switched to npm, we were using asset packs, sorry, not asset packs features to um, simply download things on the fly via HTTP. So yeah, that's the make file. Yeah, and the other occurrence was basically just for the install target. So it knows what to pick from the node modules directory. Yeah. Okay, the next interesting part, and probably the most interesting part, is how are things working on OBS. So we have here already many suspiciously looking files, all files that start here with underscore service colon and then some service name, and then yeah, also basically the actual file name. All those are generated by the services. So let's look at the services. Um, yeah, services are basically scripts executed on the OBS host, or in theory also locally if you would check out the repository locally and use OSC on the command line, for instance. But as you can see here, we don't have any specifications to run things only locally. So all of this will also run on the OBS host. So the first service is probably something you might already know. This is simply pulling the latest version from Git. And it also extracts certain files. So the spec file, for instance, is actually coming directly from Git as well and not just the sources we package. Um, yeah, so not just the sources we package and build from, but also actually the build recipes. So we have everything together in one place. And we can, for instance, change also RPM dependencies or the way we build things as part of a GitHub pull request, which is actually quite nice. Yeah, set version sets the version. Yeah, build time. I guess that's all not so interesting right now. Um, the interesting part here are the node modules. Um, that service looks for a file called package.json, or actually the log file in the repository. And that's the file you just saw, or those two files. Um, and then it outputs two files, an archive which contains all the contents of the packages that are pulled by OBS, and also an include file. So the archive is probably too big to view, but just imagine what you would normally have in your node modules folder. It's 10 megabytes. Obviously, we don't need all of this, but yeah, dependencies get pulled in. So this is a little bit huge, but it doesn't really matter for us. Yeah, then we have this file, which um, basically creates definitions of source files, which can then be included in the actual spec file. So here you can see actually some HTTPS URL and so on, which looks a bit suspicious because actually we don't have, yeah, because we don't have online access on OBS. So the
Right.
question comes up how it would work, and that we can see in the spec file if I'm finding it. Yeah, here. So yeah, the spec file also has that service prefix because, as mentioned, it comes from yeah, it comes from Git. So that's a long spec file, and I'm definitely not going into the details here, just what's important for assets. I hope I find the place among all
There
the
was the
other
include
things.
line bit above,
Ah, um,
oder line 9.
89, right. Yeah, so it's really
Yeah,
not
those
so,
two lines, or two and then the next.
yeah, yeah, so it's really not much which we need to add here, just the include files. I'm not sure why we actually have this one and source dear include, but
It
okay.
might be that we just need to specify the first one so that
Hmm,
S doesn't complain, as in all files are proper. Don't use the intermediate file, just
yeah,
define one.
probably. Yeah, so that adds then other sources as you saw in the file. It's basically a include as in C or C++, which just pulls stuff in. Um, yeah, and then the part that does the magic to be able to use NPM um, despite not having any internet access during the build. And that's this local NPM registry tool, which is useful because we simply specify as build requirement the package containing this binary. And before we run this, we have to actually remove the package log JSON file. And then we can install all dependencies using this command. It will actually run a local registry, so a service that listens on the expected port basically, and then run the install command like you would normally do, like npm install. After the command is done, the service will be shut down again, so it really only runs it internally, which means that we really have to install all dependencies in this step. We cannot just lazily install anything later. Yeah, then the build runs and the checks will pass because they have all the node modules, and the install target can also install them with that code I showed in the makefile. Maybe that could be done more elegantly, but yeah, for us that's actually good enough. I think we will also see some mentioning of node modules further down in the install section, because as mentioned, those are going to be part of the RPM package. So yeah, we have them in the final package, which is basically the goal of all of this. And yeah, so that's basically how the project is set up. So in short, it's basically just a service that runs on the OBS side to fetch the required packages from Node and some additional helpers to make them available during the build time, so we can have them when we run tests here and install things into the RPM.
I observed that this the line that you have selected installed node modules folder 4 megabytes, but the
Mhm.
archive is 10 megabytes.
Yes,
Why?
yeah, that's big for the reason why I said this is so huge. Um, so again, the archive is so huge because it really pulls in all dependencies that are listed in the package.json and all dependencies required by that again and so on.
Yes.
But we of course don't need all the files from this. It is really much more like TypeScript definitions or maybe additional modules for code mirror we don't use.
Okay.
And
And where's the selection done then? Then only part of that is copied over.
yeah, the selection is done in the makefile. I can show it maybe again. Um, so node modules. Yeah, here you can see we basically just run grep on the asset pack dev file. That was this file, which contains all the inclusions.
And those are the inclusions within each node module specifically files then.
Right. So using this grep, we basically generate the list of all the files we reference in assetpack.dev, and only those are actually relevant to be bundled. And that's of course much less. Yeah, it's of course a bit hacky, but I don't think Asset Pack does allow us to make it a little bit easier. Like, um, I don't know, do some installation command on its own. So we are doing this, yeah, quite manually. But I think it works well enough. Okay. I think that was the most important part. But actually, I'm still on the OBS topic because there's actually more to see about how we use OBS. Because we don't just have a build here, we also have builds on our pull requests. So again, that was a recently created pull request by me. And actually the checks ran on OBS as well. So we can also click on details here. And then we find a page which looks actually exactly like this page, just that it's on the ref of my pull request. And also me changing things in in the package.json file and assetpack.json file. That changes actually are visible here and considered by OBS. So you can see, oh, that actually increased the size of this archive.
Okay.
Um, yeah, and now we see, okay, all tests have succeeded. Of course, we don't run all the tests in package builds, so that doesn't mean too much. And in fact, some tests are actually still failing on the pull request. That's what I'll have to look into to move this forward. Um, Interestingly, you can also go to repository, tumbleweed, and you could, for instance, just download a single file and install it, or go to download repository and actually add that repository on your system. That's interesting because it allows you to actually test the RPM package, or we could even install it in production, which makes maybe more sense usually for the worker package. But it's quite nice to have build packages available for each pull request. And yeah, that basically works by a feature of OBS, which allows you to set up webhooks. So um, GitHub would actually just invoke some API of OBS, telling OBS, here's this new pull request, and OBS then creates a project, builds things, and then it reports the status of the build back using the GitHub statuses API. So these these checks are basically just the result of the GitHub statuses API. There's no totally fancy integration here. But it works actually quite well. And yeah, it's nice to have packages built directly as part of a pull request. And now with the new the new asset handling, um, which means things are entirely handled on the OBS side when it comes to downloading new packages. That's actually very nice because what we had before was some script you have to invoke manually um, to update the package on OBS. And of course, that meant if you would create a pull request like this, which changes the assets, all those checks wouldn't work anymore and produce faulty packages um, unless you actually ran the script manually. So you would normally just have to merge the pull request forcefully and then just update this, no, sorry, this package here quickly um, to update, yeah, the archive of assets. Yeah, I think we basically copied the approach from the Code Pilot project, which is also being built on OBS and uses the Node modules source service. Yeah, of course, when I did the research for this, I was looking into the Git, how do you call it? The Git way of doing things in OBS, but it was mentioned that it's just experimental right now, so I didn't use it. But in case you would use Git, it looks all a bit different. So I think then we would not have any source services anymore and probably just have a bot on GitHub that would push to some repository in case a pull request was created. And that bot would probably care about checking things out via npm install. Yeah, but we didn't do that because this is actually easier considering the source service is already available and it's also not experimental. Yeah, I think that's mainly it. So if you
Okay,
have any
can you,
questions,
before we come to that, could you try to summarize again where you see the benefits with the new?
okay. Yeah, of course, the benefit is that we don't manage a archive here in this repository manually.
Yes.
That was actually what I mentioned at the very end of the talk. Um, and I think that's the main benefit, that we don't have faulty checks in pull requests that change um, any of the JavaScript or CSS assets. I think another benefit is to not rely so much on various CDNs.
Uh-huh.
So in the past, that file actually contained many HTTP URLs that pulled files from various sources. And that's, of course, not so great when it comes to error feedback. Also, especially because AssetPack didn't do the best job of when it comes to reporting errors, or at least it was sometimes then just having served an empty file instead of
Yes.
the actual file, and that would be not so nice to debug.
Uh,
So this is much easier to debug. And if you do a spelling error here, for instance, in one of the local or files from the node modules folder, you definitely get a good error when you would start OpenQA.
yeah, plus the automatic updates, plus the easier review of changes, plus the possibility more easily tests changes in parallel, independent of having some merged yet to, right?
Yeah, and now we have all of our JavaScript dependencies coming via a single source, npm, because before we actually already had npm, but only for the linter, and now it's basically npm for everything, which I think simplifies things.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's really mainly it. You can see here we have a third party folder. That's because not everything was on npm, so a single dependency
Right.
that we before only pulled from some GitHub repository, um, that is now actually in our own repository, but it's also probably for the better because if that GitHub repository was going down, we wouldn't have had a copy anymore.
And it's really the exception here, and you can see that this is
Yeah, that's really small. It fits on the screen on this zoom level. Well, okay, we have a CSS file, but it's also not big. Um, yeah, so that would be maybe the approach for small dependencies that are not on NPM and probably not worth packaging. Of course, if we would have a dependency that isn't on NPM, but that is bigger than just what you saw here, we would probably end up creating an NPM package for it. Okay, so I guess that's it for this talk. Maybe, no, you mentioned benefits. One additional benefit is not only the automatic updates, but actually you can also get security alerts. I think here under security or somewhere, if there was an alert, it would be more visible.
yes.
Um, somewhere you can see,
On the left-hand
okay, we
side
have,
in vulnerability alerts from the Defender bot, that would show up.
mhm, right, and we actually had that. And the good thing is we actually didn't use the dependency at all. So I just made it go away from npm. But yeah, it's good to see that the system actually works and uh, we were
Made
aware
aware.
of any possible vulnerabilities. Yeah, but I think that's now really it. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
So, anyone like to share maybe somebody knows about alternative, well or new based on?
There are definitely many alternatives.
Okay, seems like not. Perfectly fine. Then I would just like to announce that in the next week we'll have again Friday of a week. Sorry, Friday of a month. So the topic will be roadmap discussion 2025. That is May of 20. With that, Jane, thank you. Bye. See you again next time.